Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Abbey. I am here at the Idea Lab with Latasha Morrison. We're privileged to have her as a guest. These Idea Labs are meant to inspire and meant to equip youth leaders, not just here that are at NYWC, but back home, too. We use these on the YS updates throughout the year, and so we're excited that you are here as an audience for us so that we don't feel so lonely, right, Latasha? It's great. Hey, why don't we start by just you giving us a little bit of background, share your passions and how you got into this whole idea of equipping students for social justice movements and stuff.
My name is Latasha, and I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and I moved to Austin, Texas about 3 years ago. When I was in Atlanta, I worked with Next Gen Ministries. I was the director over Next Gen at a church for about 9 years, and left there and did some consulting work and worked in nonprofit, and then somehow got called back into the church. And so I moved to Austin, but at this time I'm working in children's ministry, so which is a big difference that I thought would be easier. It's not.
Keep your jobs. Keep your jobs, youth workers.
And in the midst of that, some of the things that the Lord did in my heart was when I was in Atlanta, I was really involved with, did community engagement for human trafficking organization. They're called Not For Sale. And then when I moved to Austin, I started working with another organization called Allies for Slavery, Against Slavery, and not for slavery, against slavery. And then in that, and being in Austin, one of the threads in my life has always been racial reconciliation. And so I really saw the need for that in the church, and not just in the church, but in my life and in the lives of people, other people that I would see. And so I'm starting a organization called Be the Bridge, and so we focus on racial unity.
That was what my next question is. Tell us a little bit about Be the Bridge. This is kind of giving birth to your baby right here, so tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, basically, just in the church, one of the things that I saw, and especially moving to Texas, is that I realized that people weren't, of different ethnicities, weren't in relationship with each other. We're so segregated, and I know you guys have heard this probably a million times, or maybe you haven't, but Sunday morning is the most segregated time. And one of the things that I saw when I worked in ministry in Atlanta, Atlanta's a lot more diverse than Austin, is with our kids went to school, they lived in, among, diversity, they went to school among diversity, but at church, it was, predominantly African-American church. And so we had a desire to just be that bridge during that season when I was in Next Gen. And so we would notice that we would go to conferences, like we would come to youth Specialties, and we would notice, like, God, where are all the brown people? There's no brown people. Like, this is great. They need to know about this. This is good. This is good training. And but the way our pastor was very progressive, and so we did a lot of stuff on what people would say on the fringes. And so we didn't have a traditional, what people would stereotype African-American church. We were different from that, and we knew that, and we felt like we could fit in so many other worlds. Like, I can go into a Latino environment and be very comfortable. I can, I've spoken to an entire Asian youth group and had a great time, and so there's a lot of commonalities, and I think you just have to reach across that racial line, and we did that. And so we would partner with another church and do events together, because a lot of our kids went to the same high school. And so that's one of the things that we did as it relates to Be the Bridge. And Be the Bridge was basically birthed out of my life wanting to see something different and not just sit on the sidelines and talk about it, but to help be a solution.
What are some of your hopes and dreams for Be the Bridge? I mean, if we're looking 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line, where do you see it going?
Well, I want to help equip the church, and not just equip the church, but I want to see the people of God, the capital C church, be a credible witness for the glory of God. And so if the world can't look to us when we're, things are going on in the world, and the world they should be able to look to Jesus' people for the answer. We're his hands and feet. And they look at us and we're just doing just much arguing, and we're so divided and so segregated and so stuck. And we've been influenced by the world system, and, we're supposed to be set apart. And so I like to tell people to how do you get out of yourself and get a new perspective and get some different experiences and do some things that challenge you and that make you uncomfortable.
Yeah, so let's get really practical. We're with a bunch of youth workers who maybe are diverse in their youth group and maybe not. But we want to raise awareness for these social justice, these reconciliation opportunities. What are a few practical things that you think youth groups in particular can do? What are some practical first steps in terms of getting through the racial divide or getting involved in a social justice project? What are some ideas you have?
I would say, for youth leaders, being a youth leader myself, is that it starts with your own personal life. You can't, just like with your own walk with Christ as it relates to your relationship with the Lord, you can't give your students what you don't have, in their relationship with the Lord. So the same thing as it relates to reconciliation. If you don't have any friends of color, or if you're disconnected, you can't expect them to be connected, And it doesn't mean making every youth group multi-ethnic. That's not going to happen. I'm in Austin, Texas. I'm in a predominantly white church. I am the only brown person in my church. Okay, and this is a pretty large church, and this is not necessarily my experience because I've worked in African American churches, but I know that my church is not going to be multi-ethnic to the sense that the community is, in a sense, but we do have Asian and Latino. But one of the things that you can do is you can reach out and find out who's in your city. Who else is a youth pastor in your community? What are the other African American church? You may have to, how people say you have to go across to the Latino side or the Asian side of the town or, the black side of town. And most of you guys, even me saying that, you know what I mean. When I say that. And so sometimes you have to reach out to other churches and do some partnerships. So it may not necessarily look like, African American kids or Latino kids or Asian kids or South Asian kids come into your youth group, but maybe it looks like you reaching out and taking your kids, and not as a project. Not as a project. And and that's another thing we make a lot of mistakes. It's like, oh, we're going to the inner city. The inner city looks totally different. And the inner city is not always African American. And it could be something that, and rather than you serving, maybe you're going to learn and to watch and to listen. And to that youth leader to see how he's reaching his kids. I mean, last night, those of you who were here, they had some youth pastors from Ferguson and from Baltimore, and I had an opportunity to talk to them and hear their story and talk about their kids. Their kids are just like your kids. And the things that they're dealing with is the disparities in their school system and social, just a lot of social justice and injustices in their communities, but they're youth leaders and you can learn from them. And so I think sometimes we think we can't learn from someone that we don't have a lot in common with, but there's a lot to learn there. I've learned a lot, being in a predominantly white church. I've gained a lot of knowledge. I've broadened myself. And you think about that. Can you go into another environment? Could you go to an all African American church or all Asian church and live there for 3 years? Engage in their culture, engage in their relationships, understand their culture. And that would be very difficult for you. If you're really honest with yourself, that would be very difficult. But a lot of times on the African American side, we have to do that every day. We live that, in our schools. So we know a lot about your culture, but a lot of times in return, a lot is not known about us.
In terms of engagement in the multi-ethnic aspects, I mean, just so we can know the road hazards ahead. Are there common mistakes that you see in terms of whites desiring to interact with browns or vice versa? I mean, things that pop to the surface that you've seen, like groups try and, man, that was a mistake.
Well, I think sometimes we try to view it as a project. And so we give our kids one narrative, and there's a danger of that one narrative. The church, African American church that I was a part of was a upper middle class church, and so it was totally different from what some people were used to. So I think sometimes we can stereotype, and a lot of times we see minorities as a collective group. We're individuals just like you. And so that's the thing and it's hard to change your perspective, and sometimes you don't realize that that's what you've done. Like, you feel like if I met one African American, I met them all. And that's not the truth. If I met one Latino, I met them all. We're all different. I see two young guys here. We have different experiences. We probably grew up in different parts of the country. We were raised differently. I grew up military. I grew up in a very diverse background. My friend who grew up in Florida, she was protesting Klan rallies in Perry, Florida, when she was the same age as me. I had never seen a Klansman. And so her story is different. We all have a different story. Our experiences are different. There's some commonalities and there's some things that we can relate to just like you can, but we're all different. And so I would challenge you to really look, and I'm speaking from a more of an African American perspective because that's what I am, but really I would challenge you to think beyond, like when you do not group us. And that's the thing that I even tell African Americans. You can't group, all white people. You guys are different. You grew up different. Some of you have never seen or experienced racism or heard anything racist in your households. Some of you have. Everybody grows up different. So we need to keep that in mind.
As we begin to wind down, I've got one question in terms of totally different than what we've been talking about, but you've got a diversity in your own background in terms of your roles. Next gen, youth ministry, now children's. Anything that you are doing differently as a children's worker now to prepare them for high school and college because of your experience?
Right. I like challenges, right? And so one of the things, I wanted to, I'm a bridge builder. And so one of the things in my school, in my church, there's an MLK march every year in Austin. And so I invited the youth guy out, and he invited some of his students. One of the moms, especially the environment that I'm in, even the area is very few. I can go a week and probably not see another brown person. And so it's really difficult. So one of the moms told me, and it was so funny, she said, Tasha, because they ask a lot of questions. So I like to give grace for questions. So I said, if you ask me questions, then I can ask you questions, So why do you wear flip-flops all year long? No, I'm just joking. But it's just stuff like that I try to make it fun. But with my kids, I always try to sew into, especially when we're talking about different things, that we're all different and how God has called us to love our neighbors and what that really means. And I always try to make sure application is at the forefront of what they're learning. And one of the moms just told me, she said, Tasha, she said, to be honest, because she just wants her daughter to have more diversity in her life, and she doesn't have it in the school or in the neighborhood. And she said, you may be the only black person that our kids see. Have you ever heard that saying, you may be the only Christian that your kids may see? She said, you may be the only black person. And that's sad, and but I took it as, what? Then I need to really represent and really make sure that these kids, understand that we're all different and that we're called to love.
Absolutely.
To love the other.
Yeah,
so
that's great. Hey, we are thankful for your role this weekend with us, and as we deal with YS Explorers and the whole idea of multiculturalism, I'm excited to have your voice as part of that. And can we give it up for Latasha? Thanks so much. And we will be back here at the Idea Lab. Thanks.